I am heavy
bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! Dinner.
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
We're gonna find out.
Yeah, most of my classroom experience, like in terms of being a student, is being extremely frustrated with the classroom discussion about a text because it's
Yeah.
stupid. Like it's literally like people are saying dumb shit and it's pissing me off, and I'm just like,
People
what did
are
you just
just
read?
like,
Did you even read this book? Like saying it in
or
my head.
well, like, or people are just like trying to say some highest level shit without like having any discussion about like the basics of what's happening in this book. I remember that happening a lot in my grad fiction class, recent fiction.
Yeah, I remember taking
And it was always like by the end of the fucking however long that fucking class was, that once a week class, however goddamn long.
it's like 3 hours probably if it's once a
Yeah,
week.
yeah. And like we'd get to the end and someone would finally bring up something that all this time I was like, this is what half of my notes are about because it's the most like standout, obvious, like recurring thing in the book. It's what most of my shit, like what most of my notes are about. And like we haven't talked about it at all until like the very end. And everyone was like, yeah, yeah, that's what it's really about. And I was like, why does it feel like we just wasted 3 hours to make the most sort of basic claim? Or I don't know. Like it just felt like we were
At least you talked about claims, dude. I mean,
talking toward nothing.
mine was mostly a teacher being like, "So, what do you think about this?" And the student being like, "Well, I liked it."
No, our conversations were very much about socioeconomic status and how that is. Uh, and there was a lot of talk of ideology and how we all think ideology is something it isn't, but that was never fully made clear to me, except as something that my teacher said that I guess I was supposed to take to heart.
Wait, what ideology?
Just generally as a thing, like as a concept, what ideology is.
Huh.
And he said you should read, such and such. I don't remember. I'd have to look back at my notes to figure out what, critic or theorist had written something about ideology that was like supposedly the thing we all needed to read to understand what ideology is and I guess how it relates to, like I don't really understand entirely what this had to do with reading very recent fiction, but it seemed that everything was in the lens of maybe ideology, though we didn't really discuss it a lot, and you know, socioeconomic shit.
Right. Well, that's we've run out of things to say. I texted you about this. Just last night. I was listening to that Sam Harris thing on like consciousness, and just he's very into that kind of shit. Anybody that's interested in Sam Harris or knows about his writings and stuff, like he's got interesting thoughts on free will and consciousness and just, how the brain works type thing. And I was just so like kind of God, it just furthered me. I started thinking of like our Bloom conversation, the way that like critics use the word consciousness and what they try to mean by it.
What do you mean?
Basically, what Harris was saying was that we really have no idea where consciousness comes from, and he says it as terms of like the mechanisms of the brain that's still a mystery to us, kind of like if we define consciousness of just like having the lights on at all, like in terms of just a person being aware that they're a person kind of thing.
Yeah.
and we really know very little else about it. What it does, being aware of how and he used the example of speaking, so like you and I speaking right now, it's not like I'm consciously processing like all this stuff, I'm just talking and it's happening kind of thing. So I don't know, it just further cemented me into this kind of critics should not use that phrase to mean what they think they mean by it.
Yeah, I just don't know. I
If
think
you're going to say expand consciousness, which is what a lot of critics like to say, I'm just like, well, what the fuck are you even saying? Like, we don't even have a set definition of what the fuck.
Yeah, I get what you mean by that. I mean, like, if you think about, like, well, and we can maybe get into this when we, like, start actually talking about Merwin, but, fucking, yeah, Bill was listening to this book. I think he learned about because of Sam Harris or something.
Yeah.
But it was like, oh, fuck, I'll have to look up or ask him what it was. But it was interesting as shit. We were listening to it in the car. And they were, basically like it was exploring like what science there is, what like they're currently doing to understand consciousness and how it works. And there was this one thing, basically there were a bunch of studies that they were doing with patients who were locked in or like in a vegetative state,
right?
And basically trying to figure out if they could determine how many people who were in quote unquote vegetative states were actually like conscious,
right?
And how, like, and therefore actually just like locked in instead of actually vegetative. And it was like fucking insane. I mean, you're starting to see some of this shit come out now, but one of the things that they did was like basically like this girl who they were trying to figure out if she was like in a vegetative state or if she had like if she had some awareness. And they basically had her like think about moving through the rooms of her house to mean like yes or something, and doing something else like playing soccer or something to mean no. And it was just really fucking interesting, dude. So basically like they now have a means for people to be able to communicate even if like they have no like other way to reach out. Like if they can't speak, they can't like really use their face in any way.
All the natural unconscious things that our body does for us that we're not aware of, where you're just not doing them in a vegetative state, right? Like
I'm trying to unfreeze my video.
Yeah. Is mine frozen?
No, mine was though. I just turned it off. Yeah, I just turned it off and back on.
Yeah, so it just got me thinking, and I started thinking back to our conversation on Bloom with like, conscious, unconscious illusion and all this stuff, and I was like, man, it just further cements my kind of literary critics should not be using these terms. Like we should not be using these to mean what we're trying to say, because I do understand why they use it, right? Like, because we're talking about something that's very hard to articulate.
Oh,
like,
dude, you'll never get away from like lib arts people trying desperately to understand science.
Yeah, but not even like understand it. I just mean, science doesn't even really have an understanding of the thing they're talking about. And I know why they use it. Because art is hard to talk about. And we're mostly talking about our reactions to a piece of art. So this is why I like Bloom's idea of, it's all personal, because you can only have a personal interpretation of an art. Like there is no, like, it's an individual reading something and reacting and interpreting it.
Yeah, there is all of that, but also...
And he means that, and I guess consciousness and stuff is used as a shorthand to mean, your reaction or your kind of stimulation.
So you're talking about a context in which someone says, like, this poem will expand one's consciousness, for example.
Which is a common thing people say, right? Like, which is a common thing.
Yeah, they just mean expand your mind, which is just
which
A
means
saying.
teach you something, which means alter your perspective, which means stimulate you in some way,
I mean, it
excite
might
you.
even fucking mean change the, structure. It could mean change the structure of your fucking brain, and it would still mean the same thing. Like it doesn't, you know, it just means grow.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is
Mentally grow
I don't
in
necessarily think.
some.
Well, I mean, we could call it growth. Yeah, we could call it growth. But yeah,
I just mean as in like it wouldn't matter if whether it was like yeah, I don't know what I'm saying, but
yeah,
doesn't matter.
yeah.
Fucking, it's just people wanting to talk about like consciousness and like, I mean, it's the same thing when people talk about like all of the transcendental shit,
Right.
you know.
Transcendence. Yeah. It got me thinking, especially as we're reading Merwin this week, because he's very lofty in these kind of, like a lot of
Which
the
I fucking love. That's my shit.
well, I just mean like, yeah, a lot of the themes are big, lofty things and ideas that, yeah, it just got me thinking of like, okay, so when we're talking about this stuff, what are we saying? And it got me thinking of this thing of like altered consciousness and what do we do with that? Like, how useful is that in terms of telling us whether a poem's good or not? Is it actually saying anything? Kind of like when we say that this poem expanded my consciousness, like what the fuck are we saying?
I don't think we're saying anything about whether, well, I mean, I don't think that's even a statement of good or bad. It's just it's your personal sort of relationship to the poem,
Yeah.
right? Like I could read a poem that is technically awful, but has a phrasing in it that expands my consciousness.
I mean that's how I feel about Bukowski. I mean, I liked him a lot better when I was younger, but as I got educated in poetry, and I understand why like kind of academic circles don't care for Bukowski because he's not very structurally or technically inclined. But man, that shit resonates. Like man, some of that shit just I still think about some of it. Like stuff that I read over a decade ago, 15 years ago, that I still can remember and just be like, oh yeah, that captured something that stimulated me, that made me interested in this art form more, all that kind of
That's
stuff.
all it's got to do.
Yeah, well,
Capture
that's the thing,
something.
right? Yeah. So when we say expanding conscious, I just mean, yeah, we're putting something on the art again that it probably can't do, right? Like that we're putting a
Yeah.
limit on it that we think is helpful with talking about it, but I don't know how. I don't know. Whatever. I don't want to get bogged down with this. I was just thinking about it. I'm just rambling now with like my processing my thoughts.
I mean, it's all the same shit I feel like Ben Lerner thinks that he's doing.
Well, he's
Like when
another one where he.
in his sort of effort to, define sort of the culture's attitude toward poetry at any given moment, or why one may or may not be inclined toward poems.
Or just like a
Like what
learner.
he's trying, I think, in some way to capture, and that like fell flat because it wasn't maybe done well, is the thing about poetry that I think you hate, which is what you might identify as the like sort of abstract piece of it, which we could argue about the term. I don't really care about that, but I just mean like the thing in poetry that seeks to like not always, but very often express something that is unexpressible and is hard to
Right.
pin down.
But I not even that. I just mean like when we did our learner episode on his one essay. Not that he's doing this in all of his works, but that one essay he put out that we did with the hatred of poetry. Episode 10 available at patreon.com/heavyboard. It's
Yeah, it's probably an inaccurate description of
well,
what he's
he'll say
about.
transcendent and divine. We had a whole conversation about what he means by transcendent, reaching the transcendent. I think he means the same thing as kind of expanding consciousness, right? So this big abstract term that can be used a bunch of different ways, and we really doesn't get us any closer to like understand, in my opinion, understanding. But it is talking about something real, right? Like that kind of
Yeah.
felt
Yeah.
change that Bloom calls it, like that kind of we are feeling something here. We just don't know what else to call it, but like an expansion of consciousness
But
or like a
or the top of your
transcendence.
head being taken off.
Right, yeah.
Just same idea. That's all we're ever really saying. It's a feeling.
Although
Like
the top of your head being taken off, I would argue, is more specific than
it
just
is very
saying, yeah,
specific. But
than
Emily Dickinson
transcendence.
was Emily Dickinson.
Yeah.
Won't she?
This is a Dickinson pod.
This is a Dickinson pod.
Welcome to the Dickinson
Although
pod.
right now, today, we're part Merwin pod.
What, 50%? 50% Merwin. Dude, our host. All right, yeah, we should say
That
what
dude
this is.
fucks. He fucks so much.
Merwin fucks. Yeah, Sophie kept texting me this like all week. We were reading this book, and Sophie was in the the version we have has these nice kind of glossy photos in the beginning,
So fucking hot.
and like it says Merwin at various ages, and then like a lot of them are just when he's old as shit, like now, more recently, and Sophie just kept sending me pictures, like screenshots of like these pictures of him, and just being like, "This guy fucks," and I just started laughing like every single time, like,
Dude, I'm so hot for him.
yeah,
So hot for this old man.
Merwin. All right, yeah. Before we get to it, this is Heavy Board. This is episode 14. My name's Andrew Whitstyle.
I'm Sophie Weiner.
All right, today we're doing the essential W.S. Merwin. This guy fucks.
Dude. I mean, I'm telling you, like, y'all think it's a joke. I'm telling you, though. In his later years, he continued to be what I would call very fuckable.
Are you? Yeah, that's interesting too. We'll touch on this. Sophie was texting me about that, and I was like, huh. I wonder how much sex appeal is a part of a lot of writers' legacies.
Yeah, I don't know what it is about this guy, but so hot right now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. Like my wife always tells me stuff like that. My wife has a thing for like Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, that makes that. Yeah,
Yeah,
I can see that.
yeah. Where like she'll always say that she like reads all his books and stuff. I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, I partially regret telling Bill that I have a thing for the older, more mature Jack Black.
The chubbier Jack Black, like
The fatter, more bearded Jack
Jack
Black.
Black. Yeah, interesting. It's funny. Do you remember like I remember they used to do these countdowns on like VH1 where they had like the sexiest people or whatever, and they did like the 100. And I think Jack Black was like number 90 something on one of those lists. And this was like when Jack Black was getting very big. So like Orange County, Saving Silverman, School of Rock era, like early 2000s.
Yeah, there's just something about that charisma, dude.
I remember,
and also his
dude,
face. He's got good face.
Dude, I remember they showed this clip, like it was like Jenna Jameson or something, like doing like, this is people that don't remember VH1 and MTV in like the early 2000s was just all about like sleazy sex shit. And it was, they had
great.
it was great.
As opposed to now.
Yeah.
None of it's about that.
I don't even know what shows air on those networks anymore.
No, I use the internet to watch most of my trash TV, but also Netflix.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah, like I remember Jenna Jameson very specifically explaining why she found Jack Black sexy. Like, and he was on this countdown of like, like 100 sexiest men or something. Like, and yeah, I just remember being like, yeah, it's a strange phenomenon, but yeah, I mean,
but it's real.
But it's absolutely real, yeah. And yeah, when we say the word sexy too, I mean, like we can mean it in so many different ways, different types, different degrees. Like it's so much more complicated than just like, yeah, like the physical attraction.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. It's like the ability to make one laugh
Right.
is important to that. Or yeah, but also his beard's real good.
Yeah.
We can't pretend the looks don't matter. They do. They matter a lot.
It's funny. I've been watching a lot of the X Files just because it's like something to watch, and there's like 14 seasons on Hulu or whatever. So I like put it on at night before bed because I like the vibe, right?
Yeah.
And like I'll watch it. And there's some real bangers in there too. Like Vince Gilligan was one of the
Yeah.
main writers at the beginning, and then later became more important in the show. But like they there's a lot, like I forgot how huge that show was, like as a cultural phenomenon,
Oh yeah.
and like how many actors I see like at just watching old episodes, like in the first 5 seasons of the X Files. You can watch this if you have like any type of subscription that has X
Yeah,
Files
it's like
on it.
watching SVU.
Yeah, and there's young Jack Black, and skinny Jack Black was in was in an episode playing like an arcade nerd in like 1994, like in this X Files episode. And I was like, oh my god, he's so thin. Like he was like still trying to be like a serious actor. And God, who else did I see in that? I just saw a bunch of young actors that I was like, holy shit. All these young people coming like just starting out that I knew as like a big star because I was a little too young for when X Files was airing.
Yeah.
It's funny whenever I put it on, and my wife will always be like, God, I used to hate this. Like she said her dad used to watch it, and like she would be terrified of the music when it would come on, like at like 10 o'clock on Fox or whatever as like a little kid. And she'd
I
hear
just
like
never got into it.
it's
We
not
were like,
great,
we were just behind it.
but it's
We
fine.
just missed that boat.
Yeah, exactly. It was a little bit, and it got canceled and then brought back a bunch of times.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, I've just been watching that. It's just since we brought up Jack Black, there's like so many. It's not that is one nice thing about streaming is that we do have all this stuff that we can just go back and watch. Whereas like you wouldn't be able to watch the entire X Files series before unless you bought the DVDs. You just wouldn't be able to watch that whole thing from start to finish. Like.
Unless you downloaded it illegally.
Or downloaded illegally, in which case people were probably ripping the DVDs and putting them up online. So like, yeah, like you couldn't, you couldn't do that shit. Yeah, fuck. All right, what the fuck were we talking about? Merwin.
William Stanley Merwin.
Is that it? Okay? I didn't know what the WS. I guess I knew
William
William.
Stanley.
I wonder why he didn't go by William. Or William Stanley, but WS.
I don't know. I like the abbreviation.
Yeah, there's something writerly about it.
Mysterious. Very sexy.
Yeah, writers with 3 names. All right, yeah. So we did that. We had the same copy of the same book this time. So a rare occasion where the page numbers match up on heavy board. We both have the Copper Canyon. I think because this is the only one that put it out. Copper Canyon, the Essential W.S. Merwin, and I think this came out in 2017.
Yeah.
So this is a nice kind of selected. It tells all of his books, his translations, throughout his whole life, really. And I guess he's still alive, but
No, he died.
oh, he died when?
Yeah, he's dead. 2019.
Okay, so he died right after this.
Yeah.
A couple years right after his last book there. You can feel that, like in his last couple books here, you don't have the full thing in this book, but you have excerpts, and it's very much. I mentioned before on an episode, I've been very fascinated with these kind of writers as they get older and start writing about death, and I don't know, I just find it fascinating. Pick yourself up a copy, Copper Canyon. It's a good little book. It's a nice little anthology to have on your shelf. We'll link it in the description as always. And let's just dive into thoughts. So, what did you think? You should start because I'm only going to bring negativity to this.
I went in not knowing so much what to expect because
Same.
it was just he was not one of the writers that I guess I gravitated toward.
Same.
Initially, like when I first sort of became interested in poetry, really sort of, I don't know, I want to say there's restraint here that I was not interested in until like, I don't know, the last like 4 or 5 years.
Right.
But it was also like I from what I knew of Merwin, he was like, you know, one of the old male nature poets. It's sort of how I thought of him.
I mean, honestly,
Uh,
it's kind of
which is kind of
yeah,
accurate.
it's an
You
accurate
know, it's
description.
not wrong. But yeah, I like this. I fuck with this a lot. Which surprises me because like there were moments. There was like a dark moment. So we should mention this book starts with his translations, with a selection of his translations. He did a lot of translating. I actually like really enjoyed those. Um, then you get to his first book. That's just like his poems, and I wanted to kill myself.
Yeah, and it's very young. You can say he's probably very into Lowell, right?
Yeah.
You can kind of
Um,
feel that,
well, and I mean, he was like, I'm pretty sure he was Berryman's student too, so
right?
that would
Yeah.
make sense that he was into someone who was, you know, big around that time. I mean, I was telling you before, like I think of it's sort of one of those poets that's like crazy to look at and you think like, oh, like this is contemporary. This is just like someone who has very recently died who still was like, touched by like Berryman and Lowell and, spoke to Ezra Pound in person. Like,
20-year friendship according to the book between him and Ezra.
yeah. And however much that might be like an almost acquaintance, maybe, I don't know.
Supposedly they
Um,
wrote letters back and forth up until Ezra
yeah,
Pound's
exactly.
death.
Not
So
like
yeah,
they were like best buddies going to get coffee all the
right.
time or something. Right? But he like went to visit Pound at a hospital one day. And I guess they kept writing ever since then.
Right.
Um,
You imagine a time where you could just be like pen pals with like a writer that could like you could send stuff to and they would help
crazy.
you. Yeah, so I mean it doesn't exist any longer
No,
like
like
that.
now you would feel like an asshole. I know because like I have foolishly I remember and it was like someone like really young, someone with one book out who was in a PhD at the time, whose book I really enjoyed and like reached out to them and was like, "Hey, I really like your like I really like your book. I wanted to say that like, I'm starting out and
Right.
um I really admire this about your writing and blah blah blah." Tries that like, Facebook was still sort of the thing
Right. And it
at the
was still
time.
new and like you could do that and it wasn't so weird. Like it wasn't like people's DMs
Yeah, I
filling up
didn't
with
do
like
that.
weird sex shit. Yeah.
But I remember being like, man,
But you said
it's
you
just like
wrote
to
an
make it.
email?
Yeah, I think I wrote it like a Facebook message or something. I don't remember. But yeah, I feel like that's not a thing. Although I think like if anyone were to do it, I think a poet would be the most likely to answer you for some reason. I feel like a poet is probably more likely to answer you than a hot shit fiction writer.
I had a friend in grad school that just sent a copy of his book to like Donald Hall, and Hall before he died, I mean, just sent back a letter like saying, "Oh, thank you for sending me this book. I appreciated this poem in it," like kind of thing. Like
Yeah, that's cool. Like,
it's a different generation. I mean, it's a different era, dude. Like, can you imagine a contemporary poet?
but imagine sending that as an email, right? Like no one's
Right?
doing
Yeah.
like who's doing that?
Maybe it's the format. You're right. Maybe the format of like email is just too cold, and people it's too
Well,
easy to
it's cold
ignore.
and and there's too much of it. Imagine how
Right.
many. I imagine somewhat fewer people might take the sort of, do all of the shit it takes to like, write a letter or like print out all of the poems that, you want to share or whatever it is.
Right.
And like go and find an address to
Find an
mail it.
address. Yeah. It's much easier to find an email address.
Much easier to find an email address, much easier to end up in a spam folder, much easier to just be one of millions of like solicitations
Right.
that
Yeah.
you get as a well-known and well-published writer.
Yeah.
Um, you know. I mean, I only think about that like I wonder what Merwin was like in that regard.
He
That's
seems
interesting to
very.
think.
I don't know. I mean, you can. I don't. I have no idea. I'm sure people knew him, but like that could tell us. But he seems like kind of a kind, gentle, like warmly old
Seems
man.
very much like that, but also like somebody who could possibly like be the type to just say, you know what, it's too much. I'm gonna go spend the next several days in the woods and like I'm not going to respond to anything I receive in that time.
Kurt Cobain style, dude.
Yeah. But you know, I mean like he seems like a guy who takes the most peaceful shits.
much, much, much fiber, dude. I was eating those pineapples.
I mean just unstrained. Just I can't imagine him like or if it is, it's comical, it's gentle, it's there's not a lot of splashback,
Yeah,
you
just
know?
a soft, solid plop, dude. Good
Yeah.
stool. Stool chart. We'll have to bust
The
out the
plot
stool chart.
overheard by his wife, you know, they
Yeah.
share a giggle.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, he it does strike me maybe he was soft voiced or something.
He wasn't I mean, if you listen to him, like he has a great voice.
Okay.
He has a great voice, dude. You should fucking listen to a little bit of it.
Yeah, I didn't listen to
Great,
any of it.
maybe a deeper voice than you would think, but very. I mean, it's great. You would. I loved like it was one of those rare occasions where like you love to hear them read their poems, and
Yeah.
they sound exactly to me. Maybe and you know I have this tendency like maybe I read them a little bit faster than he does, but like they sound largely to me the same when he reads them as they sound to me on the page, which I think is in many ways the sign of a successful poem. Not entirely, not the only sign, but yeah, his first book I didn't really enjoy. I found myself sort of slogging through it, but once you hit I mean, even before we get to the book that's like his big book, that's like, you know, what people would call his breakthrough book, which is The Lice, and that's I think 67 that
Yeah.
came out. Even the book before that, I think, where he was still using punctuation, I was really starting to enjoy him. Then I got to, you know, the books where he basically stops using punctuation. I was like, this is fucking great. But yeah, he tackles all of those big issues that I love and he doesn't do like the nature thing in a way that I find like obnoxious, even though he's like, you know, people will write about like his eco poetics and how he, you know, I mean, this is a man who like lived in Hawaii and planted palm trees every day.
Endangered palm trees. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what a fucking life, dude. He also like he had like a house in France and a house in Maui.
Yeah, man, it was back when you could still have a career in academia.
He didn't have a career in academia.
Oh, he didn't?
No. In fact, he was like, I can't do that. Like, I don't, that's not going to be for me.
Shit,
Like,
I'm
I'm
feeling
not,
that way
I don't,
too,
it-
dude.
and it wasn't that he knows that it would be bad for him, but he knew that or from what he said, because they talk about this in one of the interviews that I watched, the one that I sent you, just that, like, it wasn't, he didn't know what that would do for him. He didn't know what it would do to him as a writer, and it wasn't like what he wanted.
How did he make a
But
living then? Do we know?
that's what I'm saying. I don't really fucking know.
Was he just like a trust fund kid, or
I I I mean I
what did he do? Yeah, how do you?
don't know. I mean, like, dude was like grew up in Pennsylvania.
Right.
Like,
Well, I mean, you could still be a trust. I mean,
well, I mean, I say that he like went to Princeton and shit.
right.
You know.
Uh, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what he did. Maybe somebody knows. I'm sure somebody knows what he did for a living. But yeah, that's nice. Nice to not have to work in academia. not that, to work in academia is fine. Like, nothing wrong with that. It's just, it is, it does take away from living a creative life or something. There are, when you're in school, whether you're working for a school or you're attending school as a student, there are rules you have to follow. Like, there are rules, there are punishments, there are things that like have to happen in an institution. Whereas, like, if you can exist outside of that institution, it probably frees you up to do whatever you want. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess this was still a time where you could just like move to London, or no, yeah, move to
Move to
London and
London and
become.
get a job in a factory and like be like a street poet or something, like walk around the
Well,
streets and
all I see of his time in London from this Wikipedia page is that there he befriended Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. He just like was still part of that era,
right.
it seems.
Interesting.
Or what I think of as like some distant era that like actually isn't all that distant, but was still like when, I don't know, that for whatever reason looks so different to me
Because
from
it
right
is
now.
different. It's entirely different. I mean, dude, like there's we're just starting to be able to do this now since we're like 20 years, 30 years removed from like, internet being the thing.
Yeah.
The internet changed everything. I mean, we literally, like, it's two different times. There was pre-internet and now there's post-internet. Like, that's like the world can be very much divided into that as you look back now, 20 years into the internet taking over everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's very much different. Yeah. Very, very different than. But yeah, we do want to avoid those kind of rose-colored glasses. Like, oh, it was so easy to go to France and just run into Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath at a cafe in Paris. Yeah, it was if you were a trust fund, I guess, that didn't have to work or do
Yeah, I see
anything.
really like nothing of his actual career other than writing poems
Yeah,
or like working on a play with somebody or moving. So I guess, yeah, he perhaps did not work.
interesting.
I mean, he was like a poet laureate
I
and
mean,
like he won all the big prizes,
yeah,
so
yeah. I don't know. I wonder if it was.
including one in like 2008.
Yeah. People always bash that. They were like, oh, like a trust fund. If you look through history, most of the great writers were like these wealthy people that didn't have to work.
But we would all do it if we
That's
didn't
what I
have
mean.
to.
The people are just upset because they want. Yeah, I would love that
It's my
life. Yeah,
goal,
who
you
wouldn't
know?
want that life? Yeah, like what are you?
And like not even to be rich, just to be able to like not
Right.
work
Yeah,
and really dedicate yourself to just that,
that's what I mean. It's
you
just
know?
bitterness. Like so
Good.
much of people being
Or
upset about stuff like that is just being bitter,
yeah.
salty little haters.
He actually said it was Pound that was like insisting that, I mean, he was already doing translations at the time, I think, but he said Pound really told him to translate, um, or to like go deeper into that kind of study.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably a lot to be said for that.
Shit, man, I'm trying.
But there were a lot of like, I was interested to see, so like toward not quite the middle, maybe like a third way in, you start to see like super short poems, like 1, 2 line poems.
Yeah.
I'd say this is still in the part of the book where things are largely very structured in, with like punctuation. They don't feel especially experimental, but still very much like of a particular voice that seems, I don't know, how would you describe it? Like kind of quiet,
Yeah, definitely quiet.
stripped,
Yeah, you already said restrained. It's definitely restrained.
not um not overly stylized, but not without style,
Yeah,
you know.
my thoughts were, I mean, it could just be summed up in the fact that, yeah, I did not have the reaction that Sophie had to this book. I am not a Merwin guy, and I know that now. Now I know that I've read all this and didn't. It was definitely a slog for me. I was especially finishing like those last 60 pages that I was finishing up before we recorded this. I was just, oh, that was a slog for me. A lot of parts. Not that there weren't things that I did. There were things that I marked, things that I appreciated, and all that kind of shit. But yeah, I mean, yeah, Merwin's not for me.
Yeah, I don't know. There are just so many poems in here that, like, I would say I love
Yeah.
already. And some that I just really enjoyed, like Departure's Girlfriend, which is still an earlier poem. That one's on 84. And that, I don't know. That was when I like sort of felt like, oh, shit is starting to get kind of weird. Like, like using a strange, like, personification, literally Departure's girlfriend. But he deals, like, with, big, difficult subjects that you always risk sounding cliche to discuss outright.
Right.
Even, like, even his most, like, nature-themed or, like, climate change-themed poems don't seem... I feel like you always, like, run the risk of sounding a little bit obnoxious.
Yeah.
Right, which is sort of what,
Probably less so in the 70s when he was writing that, though, like...
Yeah.
It was still kind of new.
That's true. But even still, like, now, doing it not overdone, and so it feels really, like, earnest and not cliche.
Right.
And it doesn't feel like this sort of... It doesn't feel like it's moralizing at you.
Yeah. My first question, when you were talking about the first translation section with this, I was like, all right, like, he translated from, and these are multiple languages. It's not like he just knew one. He knew a few.
Right.
Although it looks like some of the Asian languages for those translations, he had somebody help, because those don't translate as cleanly either. So it's you're going to lose something in the translation if you don't speak the language fluently. Then you're going to miss things. But my first question is, like, it does seem like it was like an older poet's thing, like a generation ago or several generations ago, that they were very obsessed with translating, like Pound and all this kind of stuff. And I just wonder, like, kind of why that is. Or why do we think it is?
Well, I mean, I know roughly what... Well, first of all, like I already mentioned, Pound sort of said, do this.
Right.
And one of the things that he said about becoming a writer was that, you have to try your best to, like, write a certain amount every day, but you're like, what, 20, so you can't write every day because really you have nothing to say yet, so you should do translation and, like, get better at listening and, like, learning
Right.
from
The universal but in different expressions kind of thing.
yeah, that kind of thing. I mean, things that you can look at as being taken for granted, I think, is the way Pound, and he talked about it. It was like, talks about translating the early troubadours,
Yeah.
many of which were song lyrics, so some of it was about the relationship between poetry and music, to go back that far,
I guess,
which made them particularly hard to translate, apparently, because they were song lyrics.
and that's, I guess I'm getting more interested in translations, not necessarily because I'm like, oh, I want to be translating these poems, although, it's more so like I've been trying to learn these languages to just be able to read, like read these texts in their original French or something, you know. I would like to be able to do that, and there is, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm asking the question, or I thought of this question as I was reading through this stuff, and I wrote down in my notes, okay, this reminds me a little bit of Ezra Pound, you know, like his kind of obsession with translating things, and you know, people have their views on how he translated things, but I just, it seems like something that has gone away. Not that it's disappeared, because it's still happening. Obviously, I mean, it's still happening. Copper
Yeah,
Canyon
it's like
publishes translations all the time. You know, the people that put out this book.
but in terms of, do poets like in their sort of
Right,
whatever they see as their sort of poetry education, whether that's like personal or if that happens in an institution, like it doesn't seem like it's commonly or as commonly thought of as like an obvious, like, you should do this. This is part of every poet's education, unless you are in a PhD program, which many seem
I
to.
was just about to say, dude, a lot of PhD programs are dropping the language requirement. So
Oh, well.
yeah, so it's not, and even so, most of them only require like, you know, 2 to 4 semesters of, you know, up to like level 3 or 4 Spanish or something. So like most, kind of a refresher from high school for most people if they actually paid
Yeah.
attention. But yeah, I've noticed more and more PhDs that are just dropping the language requirement or letting you fulfill it with bullshit kind of thing. So there
Yeah,
are
so
less PhDs in English graduating that don't have a firm grasp on a secondary language. And I mean, that is dying a little bit. And you know, Merwin in this collection has a kind of an obsession with dying languages, which I mean, it's interesting. Like, I mean, if you're just somebody who's interested in words and stuff, like languages and how they evolve and how they die out is fascinating. You could spend hours going down rabbit holes. My great grandfather, my mother always tells stories about how he would just say things in Gaelic and stuff like that, and she wouldn't understand what he was saying at like Thanksgiving or whatever. Like he would just be talking and then break into Gaelic, and it's like, well, nobody at the table understood Gaelic but him, because even people in Ireland don't even speak it anymore. So it's
yeah, I mean, in that poem that's called Learning a Dead Language, this is on page 52. The first lines are, "There is nothing for you to say. You must learn first to listen."
I wonder if that's a direct line from Ezra Pound.
I doubt it,
Yeah, learning a dead language. And I
but
guess
I'm
that,
sure I wouldn't be surprised to find that like was born out of that interaction.
yeah, and we like how many dead languages there are too. It is kind of crazy. Like I talked to you about this the other day, where I was reading a lot of Joyce recently. I pretty much read all of Joyce, uh, including his poems, chamber music, and all that kind of stuff. But it kept occurring to me that like when they would give, like he would, you know, part of like Ulysses and a lot of Joyce's stuff, he would just break into Latin or you know, any other fucking language like French or Gaelic, and he would just put that in there, and there would be no translations like in the text. And it was just like, okay, because at that time, if you were educated enough to read a novel like this, then you probably just knew Latin and French and all these different
Yeah.
things, because you just used to be taught all that at the same time. And that's just not happening. So yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense that it's like the older generation was more into this than the current generation. But yeah,
Well, not just into this, but like it was expected, I
right,
think.
expected. It was part of the knowledge base that you would be expected
It
to
was
know
also
as an expert in literature or creator or whatever it is.
also like we can talk about like it was your education was probably a bit more rigorous because you were probably competing with a lot. Um, well, the competition was probably different because you were competing for fewer spots at fewer schools. I mean, with fewer people, granted,
Yeah.
but you know.
Right. Harvard wasn't nearly as competitive as it is now. Yeah. All that kind of stuff. I mean, it literally wasn't. I mean, like what? Like it used to be
Yeah,
like,
well, there were fewer
yeah,
people.
fewer people applying. So when you only had like 100 people applying, like yeah, okay, 15% would get in. Now we have 100,000, so only like 0.5% or whatever like get
Yeah.
accepted. So yeah. All right, enough on translating. Let's get into some of these books. Which one would you want to hit first? Do you want to? I don't think we need to hit all these books, but Green with Beasts, 1956.
Yeah, that's some early shit. Were there any from that I marked?
I put Dead Language as the best poem in there,
Yeah,
but yeah,
learning a dead language I have.
nothing that I was like, oh, I really want to talk about.
Yeah, this book I didn't love it that much. It wasn't even until the following book where I really started to get interested, and then even then not until 63. It wasn't until The Moving Target that I got really interested. That's also where like we start off with maybe things that are more personal, which I'm kind of surprised that I was more into that, but I also think it's where his poems start to get shorter. He starts to experiment a little bit more, I
It was
think, and
it was just in the
things
air.
start to
I
get
mean, look at the
stranger.
date, like 1963, 1960. I mean, dude, what was happening? Oh, Life Studies was coming out. Like, literally,
Yeah.
confessional personal poetry was becoming the hot topic du jour, right? Like the kind of
Still really, really concerned with the natural world, but also like that's a thing, like concerned with the natural world, but like really, really cerebral, which I guess, that might be true of a lot of sort of nature-y poems, but definitely not all. And
I'll just say the title of the 1960 collection, The Drunk in the Furnace, fucking his best
yeah,
title. That was his best title of books, probably.
drunk in the yeah.
Great title for a poetry collection.
Yeah, none of the others really like stood out. Shadow of Sirius is a pretty cool title.
The one poem that I liked in The Drunk in the Furnace, well, I guess I liked a couple of them in this one. Or, yeah, I liked two. So I liked Fable on page 63, and I
Yeah,
liked Plea for a Captive on page 66.
yeah, I like that one
Yeah.
too. Yeah, this one it feels like he's dealing with big themes and like it felt, and maybe this is why, like, because we're getting fables and stuff, and like it felt like very much interested in like making a myth out of humanity, or that's sort of how it felt to me, which might be stupid, but
Yeah. Fable, I liked. I liked Plea for a Captive. I thought the last line was killer. Kill it once or let it go.
yep. Yeah,
Absolutely.
that was a good one.
And I think,
Which that one kind of confused me. I was like, wait, was this speaker gonna eat this dead cat?
yeah.
So like or I guess Fox.
And this is when we start to see
No.
him break away from some of the kind. And this is this, like I said, it was in the air at this time, right? Like the confessional movement was breaking out. Even Robert Lowell was turning away from his meter and rhyme and his like extremely complex rhyme schemes and stuff. So
Oh wait, this is the one with the woman who caught the fox. I'm thinking of a different poem, but yeah, I liked this one too.
yeah, there were some like some of the form, like the no and the o.
Yeah,
I thought those worked well, and then the last line did it for me.
yeah. I mean, to just get a feel for what this poem's about, when woman with the caught fox by the scruff, you can drop your hopes. It will not tame, though you prove kind, though you entice it with fat ducks. I mean, so, there's a lot in here that's about attempts to possess the world or be possessed by it.
Yeah, and also, this entire poem is one sentence. Like I was just fascinated by the structure in this one, where he's not away from punctuation yet, but you can start to see
Yeah,
his kind of
you can start to see that shift.
opening up the limits of what you can do in a single sentence type thing.
Yeah, because I mean, and you could look at this and very easily say, no, this is two sentences. Like, no, we sort of, even though there's only one period here, I'd say in many ways we actually kind of read this as two sentences.
Well, and you could argue the colon is acting, if you wanted to get into that
Yeah.
argument, and then they use the stanza break to maybe you could argue that
Maybe even maybe more than two, yeah. So I think this is where he's starting to like play and like using a comma as a placeholder for what will ultimately become like just no punctuation.
Yeah.
Which really, really suits him, and became sort of his style that he, part of the style that he was known for, or best known for. And even in the next book, when he isn't away from, he's not away from punctuation yet, but in the moving target, when we start to get those like personal poems, which I would say like we get a different kind of personal poem that come toward the end of his career.
Yeah.
These personal poems feel very concerned with like the specifics of his family life or moments in his family life.
That, and was there anything you wanted to cover specifically in the moving target? 1963. You said Departure's girlfriend. My thing about the thing with moving target, and this is just one of my personal pet peeves, the really short ones, the single sentence ones.
They bothered me too.
Yeah, they bothered me. I wrote down like how I just like the short poems get on my nerves. Like these are fragments.
They just never.
Yeah.
I'm just never convinced of them.
Yeah, these are fragments.
I'm so never convinced of them.
Yeah. This is a tweet. Like this is, and my question was, it's kind of not so much about craft or like the art or ethos or like any type of. My question was, why do these fragments bother me so much? Like, why am I so bothered by like?
Because they're not.
The Ezra Pounds, people on the subway, fucking metro, whatever. I'm so bothered by these like little fragments that people call poems.
So there's like this whole rest of a page. It's all really empty.
That, and I don't know if I think it's lazy or if I think it's weak or if I think it's I really.
It's just it feels unearned. It feels unearned
Maybe
here,
that's it.
but it's also like why. Like you can get away with that if it's like a perfectly placed moment in a book of poems,
Yeah.
But I think it feels out of place here because it's the essential Merwin, right? And you get these poems that maybe don't appear quite where they might in the book. I don't know. I don't know if there were poems in between these really short pieces that like spread them out across the book. I don't know how many other poems were in the originally published collection that these were pulled from, but yeah, here it just feels like what? It
just feels like a missed opportunity.
It just feels like that, like maybe there could be other poems here that like would be more essential. I don't know. But maybe there's something very essential about seeing a few of Merwin's like super short poems.
Yeah. Especially if they're just observations, like people waiting for a subway, right? Leaves on the wet black bow. Like
I was also like, that never did it
well,
for
that's
me
what I mean.
either.
It doesn't do it. And the reason I asked it is just to talk.
I never got into Pound.
Me neither. I'm not a huge
didn't.
Ezra Pound guy, but it's like I'm still like struggling to try to articulate why I'm so bothered by, these short little fragments. I call them fragments of poem or sketches of poems, whatever you want to call them.
Because you see that and you think like, well, I could do that. I could publish that.
Maybe, yeah.
I could write a sentence.
Right,
It feels like
maybe that's it. Maybe it's because it could only be published if you already had a reputation. That's the only time you get away with that bullshit. Like some young writer could not be like turning in a poem like that to Pofo or something to get their $250 for publication. Like it would not get published unless you were a Merwin, unless you're somebody who's huge. then we'd pretend that it's really great.
Or it doesn't go out into a journal and it only appears in
Right.
the collection.
Still.
And then, some editor says, well, it is essential that we get Merwin in all of his moods. One of them being the one sentence mood.
Yeah. Like I said, listeners, I'm only going to bring negativity to this.
I might have felt less frustrated if they had maybe shoved a few more of those single line poems onto that page.
There were
I think that's what
it was
just like, if this is so essential, give me more of this.
It was interesting too, because like I was texting Sophie, like as we always do, like when we're reading this shit, and like as we read through it, and then like I'd be like, God, I'm so bored with this, I don't like this book. And then Sophie was texting me like, oh, I love it. Like Sophie was like, I mean, I've been inspired as shit by it. Like, and I'm like, oh fuck. I guess
yeah, that's true.
I guess I just
but there
don't
were
understand.
there were other times that I was feeling really bored, like earlier on in the book, and there was still this sense of like, this guy fuck.
Yeah, dude.
This guy has so much sex.
Yeah, he was probably getting a lot of pussy, dude. Yeah, as poets often do, unless they're just hideous. But even if they're hideous, they'll probably still get a little. But yeah.
Yeah, man, you gotta hear him read.
All right.
Or just listen to him talk. It's good.
Yeah, and I didn't have
enjoyable.
time to do any of like the stuff we like to do at the Heavy Board podcast. We like to watch those lectures that have like 500 views on YouTube.
Yeah.
And absorb them and bring them into our thinking and all that. But you want to move on to the lice, the next one, 67?
Yeah, the lice is the. I mean, if we want to, yeah. Well, do you want to read one of those tiny, tiny poems just so?
Is that in the moving target?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll read the one that got me at first. Separation.
Read the one that really got
Separation,
you.
page 80, where he says, okay, separation. Your absence has gone through me like thread through a needle. Everything I do is stitched with its color. That's it.
That one really got you, huh? That wasn't the one that like pissed me off the most, because that one I was like, yeah, okay.
Which one pissed you off? The one that's unable to endure my
No,
world?
unable to endure my world and calling the failure God, I will destroy yours. Like, that doesn't feel entirely unearned to me. I just like, I need there to be more of these. Dead hand on the next page. Temptation still nest in it like basilisks. Hang it up till the rings fall. And then you get a long poem, which is Departure's Girlfriend, which for some reason I found comical in some way.
I didn't mark anything in it, so go off, dude. Speak on it. What do you...
This is where I was like, still like, I was maybe a little bit bored from the books before, and before anything else, I wrote, oh, fan of the simile, because I was like, oh my god, he uses so much fucking simile. But it's just like, it's one of those poems that feels really mysterious, and it feels like being about departure and how, it's about, in some sense, and I think, like, not just loneliness, but like an aloneness, like, or, that when something departs, you don't go with it. So there I was on my way to my boat, feeling good to be going, hugging this big wreath with the words like real silver, bon voyage. The night was mine, but everyone's, like a birthday. Its fur touched my face in passing. I was going down to my boat, to see it off, and glad at the thought. Some leaves of the wreath were holding my hands, and the rest waved goodbye as I walked as though they were still alive. And all went well till I came to the wharf, and no one. But he said to me, it isn't your boat. You don't have one. I said, it's mine. I can prove it. Look at this wreath I'm carrying to it. Bon voyage. Which, like, that moment felt hilarious to me. Did it, like... He said, this is some stone wharf, lady. You don't own anything here. Like, I mean, it like that was just I felt like a well-earned near comical moment that is rarely approached in poems, and especially like poems like this. I feel like there are small moments of comedy in here and throughout this book, but few were as loud to me as that one. But look at the reef I'm carrying. It says Bon Voyage. It just felt really. It felt like a. I mean, it did feel like a bit of a departure from the poems that came before.
Yeah, and you do see it. Like you see, I wrote that for the lice. Yeah, this seems to be his breaking from punctuation. It's not like he broke from it entirely. It was just he was playing with it much more
Yeah, I mean,
looser.
like he starts. You see it too in the moving target. He has like these short poems that have no punctuation, maybe except for the rare period or comma. But yeah, in the lice, that's in 67. We lose most of the punctuation almost entirely.
Yeah,
I think there was maybe like a couple places, but this is where like all of the really heavily anthologized poems are.
right.
This is where like you get River of Bees, for the anniversary of my death, the Asians dying, for a coming extinction. I mean, these all stood out to me as like, oh, these are the big poems of his career. Or the ones that I think of being as the big poems of his career, because they're the ones whose titles I know.
Anything you want to talk about? The only one I marked.
And honestly, when I read them, I was like, I can see why these are the big poems of his career.
Yeah. The one I marked in this was In the Winter of My 38th Year, page 109. But if there's any.
Yeah, that's a great one. I
Yeah,
marked the one before it
the anniversary of my
for
death.
the anniversary of
And
my
that's one
death.
of his famous, like Sophie said, anthologized.
Yeah, because it's like a tight, good little
Yeah.
poem. It's great. I also really enjoyed The Widow, which was like weird. He does this thing where like he focuses on the collective, and maybe that's why I think of it as like this sort of myth making of humans. You know, where he says like there is no season that requires us. That I thought was a great poem.
Yeah.
But that was also the poem that I was surprised to find ends with a repeated word 3 times. Invisible, invisible, invisible. And I was like, oh man, that's never going to not stand out. Whenever someone decides to do that, it's never going to not stand out to
I think
me.
it was a joke somebody said that said if you repeat the word 3 times at the end of your poem or story, then you know you're trying to be literary.
Yeah, of
That's like a joke.
course.
Yeah. But yeah, that's true, right? I mean, because there is that powerful effect in repetition, although some of the repetition I find questionable, although not that one.
No, I actually enjoyed that
Yeah,
one,
that
though.
one
You do
works.
automatically think, even though this probably came fairly early. I mean, who else does this? We have who are the big examples? There's Haas and there's Bishop, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we haven't done Bishop yet on this pod. We should do that.
Um,
Bishop is
for
so
coming in
good.
extinction again is another one that I felt like this is a really good poem that doesn't ham fist it. Like it it doesn't go over the top.
Yeah.
Um, so many good lines.
Damn, you got me thinking of Bishop now. And everything was rainbow, rainbow, rainbow.
Surprised you're thinking of Bishop and not Haas. I don't think Haas will be your guy.
Yeah, I don't. I haven't read any Haas. Although I do have his
Uh,
book, The Little Book of Forms, or The Little Book of Form, or whatever.
yeah, no, for coming extinction, I really enjoyed Gray Whale. Now that we are sending you to the end, that great God, tell him that we who follow you invented forgiveness and forgive nothing.
My
I mean, that's a fucking killer open stanza.
my question about this section, and we can get more into detail, like going over a specific poem with this, since this is the one. like The Lice in 1967 was the one where he made his kind of big leap from away from punctuation for most of the poems in the collection.
Yeah.
And my just question is, what is that? What does that do? Why would a poet like him go away from those little kind of, useful little marks?
I think for him was just part of him coming into his voice in, like, say the early middle part of his career as a writer, like, which makes sense, like a little bit older, maybe during this time a little bit more experimental, but also because he's not someone that strikes me as incredibly experimental, someone who is incredibly like someone who feels like just sort of a copy, or like they're trying really hard to copy someone else. I feel like it just gave him a flexibility to fall into his voice a little bit more, to take out some of the pauses between sentences that, like, in the same line, I think did his poems a greater justice.
Yeah, and I saw in his stuff like in the 90s, he started to use kind of the spacing on the page as instead of commas. I mean, not he wasn't using commas for years at that point, but he did start to use the kind of white space to imply pauses or hesitations as opposed to the punctuation or standard punctuation that you would see. My theory, why do we go across, like, why? I think he's not the, I mean, was he the first poet to really go away from punctuation? No, right? Like,
Of course not.
E. E. Cummings had already happened at this point, or I guess it was the tail end of E. E. Cummings when he was publishing his first.
I never really read E. Cummings
Yeah.
and know very, very little about. I would say, actually, I know fucking nothing about E. Cummings.
Yeah.
Except that he didn't like to use capital letters.
His love poems are his best poems, I'd say, about E. E. Cummings. But yeah, he's another one that just, his reputation is such that people they either say they love it or they hate it.
Yeah, I just don't know it.
But like you said, yeah, not using punctuation. Okay, so we get freedom. You're not constrained by the.
It's not even freedom. It's just a different kind of flexibility, right? Like, to do something different with, like, your particular cadence and your, want for urgency in certain places. Just the way it suits his ear, however he hears it. Which I think we also are seeing a lot of right now. That's really hot right now.
Yeah.
Is to doing the no punctuation, bleed over, make this sentence become the next sentence kind of thing, which isn't really. I assume it was more novel at this time, but also, like, it doesn't. For him, it feels like something that works, is very, like, functional and suits his voice, and not something that just feels overly stylized.
Well, it's interesting.
Or experimental for the sake of it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up compared to, like, kind of the contemporary trend or whatever. Not that everybody's doing this, but yeah, it is popular right now.
I mean, and we'll, like, talk about trends as though, like, we can see them from some 30,000 foot view, but, like, we can't actually. We just sort of know what we think we see.
The other side of the coin, no punctuation. So for me to keep bringing my negativity to this book and Merwin's work is, it's easier, right?
No punctuation?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say so. I think it presents its own complications. I think people think that it's easier, and then like, I think that's misguided. Like, I think it's
well, you're right.
difficult. I think it's easier if, like, you are always breaking with syntax, if you like, maybe, it really, really depends, I think, on where you would expect that punctuation to fall.
Well,
If it's naturally going to come at the end of the line and you're always breaking, like, or if it's naturally always going to come, like, if the end of the line and the end of the sentence are always going to coincide, then yeah, not using punctuation is super easy. Or if you're not, if you're always breaking where you would expect there to be a comma, yeah, it's going to be easy. If you're always breaking in on exactly the same kind of syntax or the same part of speech every time, that's one thing. You complicate things when there's no capitalization, there's no punctuation, there's no additional space to let you know that a new sentence is starting within the same line.
yeah, there's that. Although he really doesn't use capitalization to indicate sentences.
No, it's not.
Yeah, you're right. Because there, what I mean by that is,
His poems are all initial capped.
yeah, which
Or not, no, not all of them. The later ones, it looks like are actually.
yeah, when word processors and you could change it, then it stopped.
Yeah.
But yeah, like so, like when I say easier, it makes it easier if you do nothing else. That's not why I think he's doing it. Because, like you said, you can use other things, and I think he does that. But yeah, if we compare it to the contemporary, I think it's a lot of just kind of imitation, uh, imitating somebody like Merwin or Cummings.
Which is like always going to be a thing, right? Like you're going to see whatever the hot poets are doing or whatever gets you initially interested, and you're going to see how they're experimenting, and you're going to go, "Oh, I want to I want to do the next hot whatever, I'm going to do the next hot collection of persona poems."
And will only
Whatever it is.
and I think it comes from an understanding. So once you understand your own language very thoroughly, and in Merwin's case, you can understand several others. Particularly, he said he mostly did Romance languages, so again, Germanic rooted languages. So it's like those line up a little bit better, but you do learn more about your own language when you're learning like the other languages that branched off from the same thing, type stuff. And I don't know, I think you do start to try and evolve to experiment beyond, yeah, like the kind of structural confines of statements, sentences.
Well, yeah, especially because like he also very much had a voice by now,
Yeah.
right? Or at least like I look at it and I think he does, and maybe to him it felt like somehow different. I don't fucking know. But by the time we get to the lice, it feels like it's super different in voice from his other books before it. It still feels very much like that voice, just slightly like, slightly more developed, or like slightly more sort of set into like a style that suits it the best, or like maybe just experimenting to do something slightly different than you had been doing for your last three collections, which is like, in some way, I think what you hope for, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, you're
oh, well,
always
maybe it's
evolving.
actually not what you hope for, because, like, at least not as readers of poetry. I feel like when we go to rush out to buy whoever, just put out a hot book, right? If it's like a poet that we know and a poet that we like, and we just read their last book and loved it, we have some expectation that the next book is going to be one that we also like, which is to say that I think sometimes we get angry when style changes and we don't, you know, and maybe it doesn't suit us quite the same, or maybe, it isn't, as it doesn't become as much of like a cult classic. Like, look at Richard Seiken, Crush was like such hot shit. I don't think anyone really had much to say about War of the Foxes
Yeah,
when it finally came out.
because if you read
And
it,
I don't think it's a Well, yeah, it's not bad though.
It's
Like, it's not, you don't read that and go like, ugh, ugh, like it's not
yeah.
a horrendous book, right? Like it's just not the same, like it's very different and it is not the Richard Sykin that we wanted.
Um,
We wanted the Richard Sykin that writes I touch myself, I dream.
yeah, Sykin's an unusual case though because he just
He puts out a lot
well,
less.
he's only put out 2 books. I mean, in like 15, 20 years. I mean,
Yeah. Some poets will do that. Merwin, I fucking admirable. I
yeah.
mean, he put out a book every 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Psychon's a different one, and I'd have to reread both of those back to back here to see what I. But I remember thinking the same thing because it was so different, but it was also like that book felt like from what I know about Psychon's second book, he was so desperate to not do Crush again because it did get him so much kind of accolades and kind of fame as much as fame as poets get, which is, not very much at all. It's and I don't know, you can just kind of feel it. There's like so much resistance to like you can feel it.
Yeah,
Like there's
and
a
well, and
holding
I think that
back,
like
but
is normal though. Like,
well,
or
I agree that that's
I mean,
normal. It's just you can read the it's like it's a resistance but not in a good way type thing. Is how I would phrase it right now. Not having read either of those books in like 5 6 years.
and sometimes I feel like, you just get fucking sick of yourself.
Yeah, well, it's a little different too, but
You got to change it.
yeah,
I'm sure that happens too. Or you change it for a minute before returning to the thing that, you were sick of.
right. Well, we talked about this with Bogan, but I mean, you're looking for something. After a while, it's like, okay, well, now what? All right. Do you want to move on to Carrier of Ladders?
Yeah, I mean, like, overall, like, do you have any feelings about the lice?
I mean, nothing that I didn't already say.
Yeah, I thought it
And the
was,
winner of my 38th year was the one that really stood out to me.
yeah, I thought thought it was a good one. I'd be interested to see the whole book and to all of the poems in it. So,
Yeah, buy yourself a copy. Do you want to move on to the next one or Carrier of Ladders, 1970?
yeah, you start on this one. This is where I started to sort of drift away. This is where I gave up. No, I'm just kidding. This is where I ran out of time.
Honestly, this is where I started getting my frustration was coming full on right here. I was getting very loud frustrations in my head. My first question was, are these lyric poems? Like, does Merwin write lyric poems?
I mean, yeah. Well, hang on. I'm looking at the wrong book.
Starts on page
I just
120. I was like, are these lyric poems, and is that why I don't like them? Carrier of Ladders was where I was really kind of just like, okay, I would read a poem in this section and then be like, all right, what is this about? And like I said, my kind of frustration started to build.
Yeah, I mean, I would still say these are lyric poems.
One that stood out to me was The Night of the Shirts, page 133, where I read it twice and was just like, I don't know what this is saying.
Oh, pile of white shirts, who is coming to breathe in your shapes, to carry your numbers, to appear? What hearts are moving toward their garments here? Their days, what trouble beating between arms? You look upward through each other, saying nothing has happened, and it has gone away and is sleeping, having told the same story. and we exist from within, eyes of God, of the gods. You lie on your backs, and the wounds are not made. The blood has not heard, the boat has not turned to stone, and the dark wires to the bulb are full of the voice of the unborn.
Yeah, sit on that, listeners.
I think this is meditation on a pile of white shirts.
What's it meditating on though? You know, like that was my whole like. What the fuck is it saying? Like, okay, here's some white shirts in the corner, and I can paint you a little image about people putting their arms through it, and like, oh, the journey this shirt's gonna go on. And I was just like, And this is,
I think it's more about
yeah, go.
you look upward through each other saying nothing has happened and it has gone away and is sleeping. Yeah, there are lines that trip me up here. I'm told the same story, and we exist from within, eyes of the gods. I mean, I think this goes back to that idea of like, I mean, there are a lot of themes here that I think that he plays a lot with, like absence and like, you know, I was talking about sort of the making of the human myth and, you know, also a collective, a sense of a collective that you never actually know.
Yeah, I didn't get any of it. That was the example I put out where I was just getting frustrated with this book more than I already was. On that poem specifically, I was like, I'm going to mark this one and be like, yo, what the fuck is this?
Yeah, the trouble with trying to like squeeze a book like this, you know, in a week, it's like you have to do sort of nothing but read this book. Like read poems over and over again. I mean, like the poems that I deeply wanted to understand, I had to reread, you know, a bunch of times. But like this is one of those poems that until I have like read it, you know, maybe 5 times, I won't be convinced of it, you know. I'll trust it a little bit because it's there, it's in this book. Someone said it was the essential Merwin.
Yeah.
But
Night of the
yeah.
Shirts.
Yeah, I struggle with this
Yeah.
one.
And that
But
has just
I
kept.
think that's also one where you can read into like the themes throughout, you know, where he talks about life as a strange garment, being in one's life as in a strange garment. I come back to that. Which, you know, is always a tricky thing, leaning on other pieces of other poems to make sense of a different one. But it's what we do.
Oh God, makes my eyes glaze over, dude. Oh, pile of white shirts, who is coming to breathe in your shapes, to carry your numbers? Uh, we're talking about fucking shirts, right? Like, we're talking about fucking shirts.
He's talking about people more
Like, I don't see it.
than shit. Yeah, it's a difficult one. It's one that, you know, you can have all your convictions about what it's doing, but you still get to the end and you're kind of like, I'm not sure what's happening here.
It's not even that, like, I'm not sure what's happening. He's talking about people wearing shirts. Like, is that what this poem is about? Like,
I mean,
you're a person
well,
and you wore a white shirt.
I mean, you lie on your backs and the wounds are not made. The blood has not heard. The boat has not turned to stone. And the dark wires to the bulb are full of the voice of the unborn. I mean, I sit here and I am struggling with that a little bit beyond just we're people, we wear shirts.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean. That's what I got. That's what I got from like a lot of these poems. It's like, oh, we're people, and here is a tree.
Yeah, but well, I mean, I think that makes me sad for you, but also I don't think, yeah, there are moments here, like the things that trip me up aren't necessarily like that up to a certain point. Like I'm with the first stanza and then we get to the second. You look upward through each other saying nothing has happened and it has gone away and is sleeping. Once we get to that I don't know what we're talking about. And I think that's one of the places where I struggled with him in places, or where it felt a little bit ungrounded, but usually in a way that I can enjoy and can deal with.
Not,
But this is one of those places where, yeah, it sort of escaped me.
yeah.
Or it is currently escaping me.
And the reason I get kind of irked by this stuff is because it is like, I get so frustrated when people, I don't know, when a poem forces you to bend over backwards to like make sense of it. I'm just like, how can we call this like successful if like, I don't know, and we
Well, I
pretend
think it
that
depends on
vagueness.
what kind of sense you're demanding. If you read a poem and you sense that it is meaningful, whether or not you can like define what that meaning is, I don't think it matters. If you read a poem and halfway through, like, you stop really getting a sense of what's happening because there's like a stray it in there that refers to kind of nothing,
Yeah, he likes to do that.
I think that's different. I'll bend over backwards to make sense of a poem that wants to be a riddle. Like, if it really wants that and if it has an answer. But other than that, I think what you're trying to do with a poem is you're trying to, like, not nail it down into like a really one clear specific meaning, although that happens. But you're piecing together smaller meanings that lend themselves to some larger sense.
Yeah. My thing is
But
just
yeah,
when we do that, we pretend that like vagueness or mystery is like a great skill, and I'm just like, isn't it the opposite of that?
yeah, it's not that vagueness or mystery is special. It's that, like, if you can achieve a certain level of, if you can make something really good with the barest of language, like, that is something that I think you can be proud of.
Sure.
But and I think sometimes the thing that can feel mysterious about that is that the language is so stripped back that maybe it is not as descriptive as we expect, or as we learn as, what poetry is supposed to do, or uses abstraction, and then that feels, all mysterious because you can't see, what you can't see. You can't see an abstract word or an abstract idea, I mean. Yeah, I don't know. I had moments like that too earlier on. I don't remember. There's one here that I just put a big question mark next to, where I was like, I kind of liked this, but I really don't fucking know what's going on. And I think it was one of those cases where, like, you had a weird pronoun in there really early on, and I'm like, I don't know what it is here. What is it referring to? Um, and so, like, it sort of instantly, I was lost.
Right. Well, that's what I always mean, and I guess it comes down to the fundamental question: is okay, what is the point of composing something like this? So, is it like, do you want people to understand what you're saying, or do you want them to just put whatever they want on it? Because, like, what is the point of what we're doing, right? Like, I remember it's like almost like elementary stuff in like workshops. Well, like, people will put whatever meaning they want on top of something, but like, is that the goal of what we're doing when we write something, or are we trying to get across something very specific?
I don't know that specific is a weird word.
I don't think so.
I think you're trying to express something.
Sure.
I don't know that what it
Something.
is you're trying to express is always able to be easily defined.
Sure. But that's what I mean, that's the art, right? Like, expressing something, right? Like,
Well, many would say it's expressing the unexpressible. Inexpressible?
yeah, well, again, that's just gibberish
Unexpressible?
to me, like that's not an answer, like that's, well, like if somebody were to say that to
It's
me,
an
yeah.
answer, it's just not one that you
Well,
like.
it doesn't say anything is why I don't like it. It's not like I'm like choosing to ignore it. It's just saying nothing. It's like, well, you're expressing the
No, it's
unexpressible.
saying nothing to you.
Well, what's it saying then? Like, that's what I mean. So if somebody says,
That's what I mean. Like, poetry, that, like, this is what this is the thing that I think Ben Lerner like failed to talk about, that like people like T.S. Eliot did really fucking well when he says things like make it new, or it's not that like you're trying, or sometimes it's about expressing something entirely new, or making something entirely new happen on the page that surprises even you, right? I think
I get with that. Yeah,
there's
I get that point.
like it's not always just going to be like I can summarize this down to
Well, not that like it has to be
a one
summarized, but I just mean like by the act of writing a poem. Like the act of writing a poem, you've just expressed something. Like you've just, what is
Sure.
it? Is it a good expression or is it a bad expression? Usually a good expression we can understand. Usually a bad one, I would say is,
I don't think good and bad are especially useful terms in this. Like, what do you
well, I just
mean?
mean in
What does
terms
that
of the
mean?
art. So I would call what we just talked about.
Effective or ineffective is maybe, is
Okay.
it an effective? Is that what you're saying? Like, is it an effective? Does it express something effectively or does it not?
Yeah, which,
Because I think that's a
sure.
question of intention and whether it achieves intention, in part
And
at
if it
least.
doesn't express something effectively, would you say it failed or it's bad?
If it expresses nothing, yeah, but I don't think saying that poetry attempts to express what is not expressible says nothing.
Well, right, because you've written something like it's an expression. It's there. It's written down, right? It's there. It's physical. It's on there. Like it exists now. That's what I mean. So
Right.
like I would call night the night of the shirts. I would say it's a bad poem, and I would say it's a bad
Yeah, I mean,
poem not for technicality or structure reasons, but because it says, I don't know what it says. Like I don't know what it's expressing essentially.
yeah, I think it fails first because it loses me around that pronoun. I still think it's like it starts falling apart at the
So maybe there is structure issues because I mean I could point to the we that's brought up to it randomly, like we just have a we. If we're referring to what's in the poem, it's just like the shirts and then like some vague sense of something, person wearing the shirt.
yeah, there are some, I think, issues of clarity here and of, not knowing what certain things refer to in particular pronouns.
Right. When I mean usually that would be considered a flaw, considering I would say as a flaw.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, that's just how I feel about. Uh,
I'm trying to find the one poem that got really fucking tripped me up. Again, like I didn't really fucking read this book. I mean, I read this book. I didn't like that particular book is where I started to like run out of
yeah, we
time.
should move
Because
on.
I'm a slow as fuck reader, you guys. Slow as shit.
Uh, yeah, we should move on. Do you want to hit the miners' pale children?
I mean, we can just say that that is a collection of lengthy prose poems. I didn't not enjoy that first one, but I can't say I read the others.
I actually didn't mind Turgvinder's Stone. Is that how you say that?
Shit, I don't think.
140, page 140.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only way I would think to pronounce it. Turgvinder.
I don't know. Part of me was like, should I do the French pronunciation of that G? I don't know. And for me, it wasn't like so much that like I was like, oh, this is great. It was just like for me, this worked all the way through, and it told a story and said something. So it was almost like I liked it because it relieved me of what we just talked about. Like I was desperate to find something that I could understand. And when I read that one, I was like, oh, I understand that one. Yeah, okay, good. Like I was like, oh, okay, I don't mind this one. Yeah, it says something. It's talking about something.
Well, I think that's the issue a lot of people have with most of poetry, right? Like, they want to have the sense of, I understand this immediately, I know what is being said, and I can make sense of it.
Yes, I agree with that. I think that is the thing, but I think it's also because the way we've coordinated or curated the kind of poems that people are presented in like a basic public school kind of high school lit or English course curriculum is that, they'll pick things like the Night of the Shirts and be like, you don't understand this? Like, give it to students, but you don't understand this. You must be a
Love them
moron.
shit.
You must be a moron then if you don't understand it. And that's what turns people off from it. So, like, uh, you know, something like Robert Frost, people will always have to read that, but it's like you understand exactly what's happening. And people could talk about interpretations, but yeah, I don't know. I think that's part of it too. So, yes, people don't want to do the work that reading a poem requires, and that's part of it. But then I
But
think,
you also don't want to do the work to no end.
yeah, exactly. And I think
Right.
the part of it is what is presented. So, like, even things like you and me, like, we're overeducated on this thing. So it's like, we
You also don't want a poem that makes sense, that makes you work too hard, right? Like there is such thing, I think, also as like having to work too hard to put together what a poem is doing. It is obviously generally an expectation of poetry that as a reader you are participating in the poem's making, blah 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 blah. Right? Like poetry has high expectations of their readers as being active readers, like, but yeah, you also still don't want to have to work so hard as to
well, and I was watching that thing about
be bothered.
yeah, I was watching that thing about consciousness, and then I was thinking about, yeah, like how that's used. And I think that too is that because art is hard to talk about, and because it's such a personal, comes from such like kind of a personal experience point of view kind of thing, it's why I take issue with, like, so all we are able to do is point out allusions and references, things like that, because otherwise we wouldn't have anything to say, kind of. So like,
Yeah, well, it's all an act of interpretation,
poetry
right? Like,
becoming this kind of thing that we just like. I guess my thing is like, okay, the framing that we use to talk about poetry, what if all of that is fucking wrong? Like, what if that was all just made up one day because we just didn't know what else to say? And as the more I learn, the more I read about it, like, it just, the more I think that that's the case, kind of thing, is that,
what
well, that we've been,
specifically, like,
well,
what?
just like the obsession over all these things. I mean, I haven't even really been able to, I mean, I'm just thinking about it, like I said, and
Yeah,
I
I mean, I think there's,
I need to think on it longer to be able to articulate it in like a coherent way. But like,
I'm a sucker for some, like, I'll just sort of fall into whatever explanation someone else gives me that I latch onto. And currently, currently I'm a Bloom groupie.
yeah, well, that's interesting too, because
And so,
if
therefore, poetry is essentially figuration.
figuration, well, I think that's a better, right. So that's the definition. But I just mean like articulating
And
something,
which I also wouldn't even say that that's like just what poetry
right?
is, but I think that's a really good way to think about it.
Yeah, and we've managed to nail down a few things. So like we've managed to nail down figuration, we've managed to nail down like illusion and things like that.
Which is just part of figuration, right? Like it's
Structure.
all.
Yeah, if we want to
I mean,
broaden
I
the
just,
definition,
I mean,
yeah.
maybe, I guess I just lump all that shit in, even though it may not be,
Well, the way
right?
Bloom explains it, I think makes sense, which is where he kind of lumps that into, like, this is one form of figuration, kind of thing.
Yeah.
The illusion, right? All that. So it's an easier way to think about it. I think it makes sense to think of it that way.
Again, also people have different fucking tastes, and like, someone out there really likes, what Lana Del Rey has to say, and that's really fucking great for them. Awesome. I really think that's lame, but that's me, right? And that's my taste that I will tell you is, in my opinion, correct.
Yeah, I've just been thinking more and more about it because, and like I said, as I was listening to that thing on consciousness, and from like kind of a neuroscientist perspective and understanding of consciousness, I was just kind of like, damn, yeah, this has no place in literature. Like, we don't understand this enough to be using this word. to describe something that we already struggle to describe, like, you know, because it is hard to describe. I don't know. The more I read about it and the more I get into it, I'm just convinced that, yeah, I don't know, we're doing it all wrong. But, you know, I'm nobody, so I'm just one person thinking out loud, and then,
I don't even doing what all wrong. Like, I don't even fucking know.
well,
I don't even know how useful it is. I'm just gonna, I don't know. I'm becoming more and more of the mind that, like, fuck it all. I'm just gonna read and I'm just gonna write, and that's that.
yeah,
And, like, whatever other people have to say about
that's all
it
you can
is.
do. Yeah, I mean, that is the solution, right? Because I don't know. It's just, yeah. I find myself more and more like the more I read, the more educated I get, the more I take issue with the way we frame our discussions around poetry and works of great art. But that's a huge side note. Just something that I've been loosely working over in my head.
Just a note.
Yeah. I disagree with the fundamentals of judgment. No, it's all right, yeah, let's skip that one then. The Miners Pale Children. Fuck that. Uh Next one, you want to move to the next book?
I mean, we could probably talk about, let's see, where are we at? We're at like 2 hours. Probably talk. I mean, we could probably just like split it up into areas of his career, like early, middle, late. We could talk about his late career.
Is there anything you wanted to cover before we move there? Because at that point we're just at 73. The one in Writings to an Unfinished Accompaniment, another good title for a poetry collection. The one that interested me there most was Ash. I thought that was the best one. And that's
What
also
page is that?
page 158, and that's also where I started thinking in my head as I was reading through this that like he was probably very much into Whitman. I started getting a lot of kind of like Whitman things just started to stand out to me, and maybe it's because we just read that book, you know, a couple weeks ago. But
Yeah, I think he was really into Thoreau,
yeah, same stuff.
which is what I learned. Yeah, which is for our purposes essentially the same stuff. You said 150.
158.
I guess I also marked the unwritten, which is right before that.
The church in the forest was
Ash.
built of wood. The faithful carved their names by the doors, same names as ours. Soldiers burned it down. The next church, where the first had stood, was built of wood, with charcoal floors. Names were written in black by the doors, same names as ours. Soldiers burned it down. We have a church where the others stood. It's made of ash, no roofs, no doors. Nothing on earth says it's ours. That one was one where, again, this one stood out to me because I was like, okay, that one works all the way through. It's very clear what's being said, even though it does touch on his kind of, he likes to bump elbows with these big, large ideas of like, what's the point of human beings being on Earth?
And also just like what we own, what we claim to own,
Claim to
possession,
own.
what we possess versus
Yeah.
what possesses us. Yeah, that was the big standout theme for me throughout this book. I mean, throughout like the essential Merwin, not just this,
Which is a theme
not just this one.
it's good that you point that out because I think maybe that's why I'm bored of it, because it's just a theme that I've heard so much in my life of being a reader that I'm just sick of hearing
But
it.
you're going to. I mean,
Yeah.
you can get sick of hearing it. I think that he does it in a way that's like sort of timeless, and I mean, it's been canonized enough that it is.
Yeah, and I think a poem like Ash is doing it successfully in that way, kind of hitting that, you know, reducing everything to like ash, right? Everything burns, right? This kind of
Yeah.
we can build
Yeah, and I would
something
say
and
like
say it's
this.
ours, but you know, is it really ours? But then again, on a long enough timeline, sure, but it just depends what timeline you're looking at, right? Like that's always my issue with we own
Yeah.
nothing.
It's largely uncomplicated,
Yeah.
which doesn't mean it's bad at all. It's good. It uses repetition well. I enjoy it. You own nothing and everything is the same. That's what you'll learn.
Yeah.
That's what you'll learn from Merwin.
After that, I Really didn't mark anything in the compass flower or the houses and travelers.
Yeah, neither did I.
But the opening the hand, 1983, there were two things. I marked one poem that I thought was terrible, and then one that I thought was really good, which is Berryman, that Berryman one.
Yeah, that Berryman one was good.
Because if you haven't figured it out yet, listeners, this is a Berryman pod.
This is a Berryman podcast.
Yeah. But the one that I marked that I thought was bad was the first one that they have in this. So I don't know if it's the first one in the actual collection, but the first one in this selected kind of, summary of the whole book, Yesterday. And I was just like, it's another
What page?
Page 181 is the bad one, Yesterday, or at least what I think is bad. And that was just another one that had the same issues with like the Night of the Shirts, where I was just like, this is of so little consequence. Like, this is saying so little. And I would say a lot of, I mean, for me, I said the line breaks, a lot of them were careless, but it was like, people would argue with me about that. I was just like, man. And the same with the repetition. I would say this is one where the repetition actually hurts this poem. And then it's like called Yesterday. And I was just like, oh my God. Like, I don't understand how people can read this and say this is good, but I guess I'm the freak. Like, I'm the odd man out, right? Like, but I mean, we don't have to get into it. We already.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna say the
I mean,
same
I think
thing.
this is a poem about avoiding the dying. Oh. And then on the next page we have the one with the Sejoras.
The questions the tourist.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is, I wasn't into that. Is that one of those ones where you can read two different sets? The fuck is that called?
A contrapuntal.
Yeah. Yeah, I was disinterested in that. It is very long. It is very long for what it is.
Yeah, Berryman's a good poem, literally just about
Yeah, let's talk
things
about the
Berryman
Berryman
taught
one.
him about
Yeah.
writing. I mean, what more can we say about this poem
Yeah.
except that it was about a lesson that Berryman taught him? Yeah, he suggested I pray to the muse, get down on my knees and pray right there in the corner, and he said he meant it literally. That's the one break that I really didn't like. But maybe I'm reading it wrong.
But the fourth stanza.
Yeah.
Yeah, he suggested
Fourth stanza,
I pray to the
third
muse,
line.
break, get down on my knees and pray. Break, right there in the corner, and he said he meant it literally. It's, not as bad as some of them, but yeah, that one is a little awkward, but if you... that's one thing too. So when you're not using punctuation to give us... I don't know. There were inconsistencies.
It doesn't even need to be about punctuation. This is just like... That's just like a weird... It's like you have that rhyme with he, literally. Doesn't need it. It could have been broken at the and I think it would have felt more natural. And maybe like he wanted that disruption. Maybe he wanted to hang on the he, and he meant it literally. You said he meant it literally. But I think that's like sort of an interruption. Didn't really love that break, but I love this poem. And again, really, really, really simple poem overall. Very straightforward. It was in the days before the beard and the drink, but he was deep in tides of his own, though, or of his own, through which he had sailed chin sideways and had tilted like a tacking sloop. He was far older than the dates allowed for, much older than I was in his 30s. Then I was he in his 30s. Jesus, I'm getting tangled up in syntax here. Much older than I was he in his 30s. He snapped down his nose with an accent I think he had affected in England. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing... Like, it's one of those poems where it doesn't feel like there's actually anything really special about this poem, except its sort of simplicity and that it's about, like, an iconic poet who happened to also be his teacher,
Yeah, who happened to write, like...
but like one of those lessons that I think translates really well into a poem,
Yeah.
a really good poem for like a young poet learning, as much as like a poet mid-career, but I think especially for someone becoming
What?
acquainted with really, really investing their time in poetry.
When did Berryman kill himself? Do you
It's
remember what you?
57.
I
Um,
couldn't remember if it was the 70s or the 80s.
I want to say 70s, but it might be. Saying that, I feel like I'm wrong.
Yeah. Well, either way, I just with the date of this one. When was this one? This one was 83, so it could have been like just shortly
Oh,
after
yeah,
Berryman was
that
done.
sounds right.
Kind of like an homage to the guy, kind of this, great dead poet now.
Great dead poet who was, again, also his teacher.
Yeah.
So it makes a great deal of sense. Okay.
One of the last.
72, he died.
Okay.
72.
So this was like a full decade after.
Burning out. I'm burning out.
Yeah, the last one that I really even cared about was if you want to move towards the later career, The Vixen, 1996.
The
That
poem or
book.
the book?
The book,
Okay.
but the one I liked in this one is One of the Lives.
Yeah, I think that's a big one from this collection.
Yeah, and it's definitely the best in this collection, at least of the ones that we get in this kind of abridged version of the collection. But that one, and
And
yeah, go on.
I was gonna say again, like this is where I feel like we start to get a more personal glimpse of life and family, which is again like not something that is a requirement for like good poetry by any means. It's just interesting, I think, that that's where it goes toward his later career.
And for me, this last book, oh, not the last book, but this one of his later books, The Vixen here, where it was like, this is where I started to see the kind of using the space on the page as well as his non-punctuation to imply what he's trying to do there. And I think this one, like One of the Lives, uses it the best out of the ones that we've seen in this collection. So like the way that he has the indentation on the other line, it paces the poem in a different way, and I think it just culminates in this kind of perfection in that poem, that particular one, out of all the ones, and it does it in this entire book.
Yeah, so it has like those staggered
Yeah,
lines.
exactly, and I just think
Um,
it works the best in One of the Lives.
yeah, it's something he does really well too, the no punctuation thing, the having a new sentence start in the middle of the line without punctuation, in a way that I just think is really natural to him, or feel like it sounds very natural in his voice. Yeah, it seems more interested in like, I mean, he's talking really about his family here. Yeah, what is this poem about?
So what did you say about One of the Lives?
Yeah, what is this?
I would say, I
What
mean,
is
it
this
clearly
poem
it's
doing that impresses you?
well. What really impressed me was the way that the staggering of the lines, like you said, it denotes the comma essentially. So, like, if I had not met the red-haired boy whose father had broken a leg parachuting into Provence to join the resistance in the final stage of the war, and so had been killed there as the Germans were moving north, out of Italy, and if the friend who was with him, as he was dying, had not had an elder brother, who also died young quite differently in peacetime, leaving two children, one of them with bad health, who had been, and again, like it's like this constant, like if there were punctuation, it would be commas, right? Like,
Well,
kind of
it would
thing.
be maybe later down there, right? When it becomes clear that it's becoming a longer and longer list. So like leaving two children, one of them had with bad health, who had
Right.
been
Well, it's, I
kept
mean,
out of
it's
school. Well, yeah, see,
modifying.
I wouldn't see there are a lot of places here where I wouldn't expect commas, but the commas would, I think, whose father had broken a leg parachuting into Providence to join the. Yeah, this feels really enjammed to me, like against where you would see commas. But
That's what I mean. So,
it,
like the
it, it but it
structure.
feels it feels like the enjambment is serving this well to push you past to the next line.
Well, that's what I mean. I think it's the best example of his no punctuation, and then when he goes
Yeah.
on to kind of use the space of the page a little bit more, or in this case, way more than he was, in the 70s when we were talking about him kind of first branching away, or what was that, late 60s with the lice. And like, yeah, I just thought it worked in that, particularly as he's adding these caveats.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah. If I had not done this, and also if I had done this, and if the questions that day had been this, and if, yeah. So it's like a lot of the caveats. You have to like go through and find it and keep track of what is actually being said. It's one of those interesting ones where it's like a list almost. Where you have to like go back to the very beginning to figure out what the fuck you were talking about.
One of the lives. But he's actually talking about like 5 lives.
Yeah, it's talking about a
So
bunch
that
of
works. Well, and he's talking about the chain of events leading to that one life too, right? So I think that works entirely. It was just the one I thought worked perfectly from beginning to end, and I wasn't lost and being like, so what is he saying here? I was kind of just like, oh yeah, this is a great poem. This is a great fucking.
It's just all of these things like if one of these things hadn't happened, I wouldn't be right here where I am right now.
Right, yeah, it's like kind of a deconstruction, but then like the way that it's structured, I think, is what makes that more interesting
Yeah,
than just the list, like you're
sure.
saying. Yeah. All right, you want to move on to later in life? I mean, I didn't have much at the end. I was kind of glad it was over
Yeah.
when and the poems tend to get very short, and I mean, at this point, how old was he when he died?
91.
91. So he was writing those last couple books in his late 80s. Of course the lines got shorter. Like, I can't imagine having energy in my late 80s to like write a sprawling 4-page
I mean,
like.
of a perfectly good mind, though. Like, my
Yeah, I mean
God.
that's fine, and not that it has to be
Right?
a sprawling thing, but yeah.
Ugh. And it's like one of those things where, like, you feel it, like, coming to the end, and it's like you can hear him writing about death in the way that is about his own actual death and not his theoretical death that will come sometime in the future, but, like, the death that is, like, approaching very quickly.
But man, if you make it to like
Oh,
80, shit,
God.
I'd be thinking the same thing if I
Of
made it to
course.
80. Yeah.
But even like his poem, really late poem called "Here Together." I mean, a lot more love poems. Um,
And his wife had cancer, right? Like she was
Poems
dying.
for his wife. Was she dying? I don't even know.
She
I
died right before he did. She died in like
really.
2017, and then I think he died right after, like 2 years
Oh
after.
God,
Yeah.
that just broke my heart a little bit. I
Of
just
his
feel like,
wife.
yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's just
Yeah.
because I read all of these poems to his wife.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Ugh.
It is.
I mean, they fucked so much, dude. They didn't even get married until he was in his 50s.
Uh, yeah, dude, I don't know how much fucking he was doing at 80s in his 80s, but
Uh, I like to think enough.
yeah, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends what kind of health you're in. Yeah, I guess you could do that fine,
Well, his
but
pants were very roomy. I just assumed he had a big old dick.
big old dick in those roomy pants, dude. Do you want to hit on any of those short ones?
I mean, I really like the Shadow of Sirius was kind of, I guess,
What page is that?
it's the first book that like I remember being in my awareness of it. Like
Right, right. We were in
I
college at
remember,
that time. Yeah,
well, we were just graduating high school, or I was just graduating high
right.
school at that time. And so like I didn't hear about that book until long after it had come out, but it was still like recent enough that it was, Like when I was getting into poetry, it was still a thing. Yeah, these poems didn't thrill me the same, but they did sort of. I mean, the one that I do really love from The Shadow of Sirius is one of the short ones, and it's on 289. And this is a poem actually someone from my program also really loved.
Little soul.
Yeah. Yeah, little soul, little stray, little drifter. Now where will you stay, all pale and all alone, after the way you used to make fun of things?
What do you like about it?
It just feels like a later in life moment. And maybe I'm like putting things on top of it. Like maybe I'm, just sort of, maybe I'm projecting. But like,
It's funny.
it's like it's a little bit funny and a little bit sad, and it is like, where will you, taking the assumption that a soul exists, right, beyond death, right? That used to have fun and make fun of things and be more judgmental, and once you get older, it's sort of maybe less
Right.
so. Maybe you
Yeah,
look at the
it's
world with different and kinder eyes.
makes me think of this thing that Stephen Fry always says, uh, where he says when you're younger, you're very unforgiving.
Yeah.
Like when you're young and you're judging something, or like you're very unforgiving, and then as you get older, you start to realize that you don't have to be so rigid and like this is the rule, or I don't, how dare you say this or write this line? I don't like this break, kind of thing. And in approaching my mid 30s. Some could say that I'm already in it, but I'd say approaching mid 30s. I definitely feel that. I definitely feel myself looking back and being like, maybe I was too hard on that, right? Like maybe I didn't quite
Yeah.
understand what I was saying, and I was just unforgiving about a mistake, or and
Yeah.
yeah, I think that is
All
just
the things that you start to think when you become an actual adult.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah,
And if
and
you
I
don't,
assume becomes more so as you get older.
yeah, and if you don't, well, then you probably have, quote
A
unquote, a little
personality
soul. Yeah, or a little soul, right? Like a little soul, not a big grand
Yeah.
one, just a little tiny one. We could get into soul and what that means, but I think we all know because it comes out of the religious kind of. We know what people mean when they say soul, right? Like,
Yeah.
most of the time. Yeah, but yeah, that's.
Yeah, I think The Shadow of Sirius is honestly, it might be one of the books that like I would also go and just buy.
Yeah, that too. We're not gonna. I'm not gonna link all of his books, but I'm definitely linking the one we read. And if you listeners, explore around on some of those pages, I mean, all his books are. I think all his books are still in print, right? Maybe
I
not.
would,
Maybe not
I
some of the older.
maybe not some of the older ones. I don't know. I'm sure you can find a collected Merwin.
Yeah,
I haven't looked for his really early stuff, but almost certainly any of his later books you could find. I imagine even his middle career books you could find.
yeah,
There's always like some poet, occasionally you'll look for like their first book and you'll find it listed somewhere for like $300. Like, but which is insane. Don't buy that unless like you're crazy rich and have money to blow. But
I mean, in today's day and age, too, dude. If you have that kind of money, shit. If that's the last book, there's no guarantee that they're gonna do another printing. Like, there's
yeah,
no
it's true.
guarantee
But yeah, for something
that.
like this, for such a
Yeah,
beloved poet and one who is, like a former poet laureate, like he was poet laureate
right.
during Obama, right? Like,
Yeah, I guess he was in the 2000s.
yeah,
Yeah, I didn't know if he was right before that. I didn't know if it was like a Bush. Does the president? I think the president appoints it, right? It's like a
yeah,
symbolic thing.
yeah, it was
Okay.
Obama.
Yeah. Okay. Yo, Obama gave a lot of shout outs to like writers.
Yeah,
Like he said, "Fuck it." He gave Stephen King the Medal of Honor, right, or the Medal of Freedom, rather. Sorry.
Oh, I don't remember, but that's dope.
Well, that's what I mean. And like he was the one that had the balls to be like, yeah, I'm going to give Stephen. He's one of the most important American writers to ever live.
Fuck
Okay,
yeah,
here he
dude.
is. Yeah, you deserve this. Like kind of thing. And like people are,
Probably
oh,
one of the fucking most read, whether
well,
people
that's
in
what
the
I mean.
literary
Yeah, like
world want to acknowledge it or
literally,
not. And I
yeah.
think more and more people are coming around to that too.
Well, it's because like I mean, it's a young writer thing, right? Again, it's the unforgivingness of being in youth, right? Like that kind
It's
of
the desire to be the best and only
yeah.
accept
He's
the
not
best.
doing what I'm interested in, therefore he sucks,
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Whatever
Like,
you
and
think the
it's
best is.
right, yeah.
And
So and
the
then
best
that's a
often
young.
coincides with whatever is literary. If you're someone who's like coming up in that world and you're like learning about,
I think it's
capital
a
L literature.
well, I think that's a learned reaction too, and we talked
Of
about this
course it
some on
is.
Stephen King, where like what I noticed when like people in graduate school or literary circles, they would mention as like a point of pride that they've never read a Stephen King book,
Yeah.
and then,
And it's like, oh,
but
so
then
it's
again,
just another book you haven't read.
yeah, exactly that, and I would also be like, yeah, but you saw those movies, didn't you? Like, like you saw The Shining,
Yeah,
right?
that's why
Like,
it's
you
really fun to
saw
ask people their position on book versus movie and then ask them if they've seen The Shining.
yeah. Which you can check out on our Patreon, patreon.com/heavyboard. We do a whole episode on The Shining and compare it to the movie. Available on all platforms, wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, man.
Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon. I don't think anybody uses Amazon for podcasts, but we're on there.
Um, yeah, I fuck with Merwin. I enjoy it. God, oh my God, that you told me about his wife makes the last poem. This one I'll accept. It's a little three-line ditty called
What
Wish.
page?
And I feel like when you're this accomplished, you just get to do that.
What page?
323,
Oh,
it's the very
okay,
last
the very
poem.
last one. Yeah. But I'll say this one is very specific in those
And
three lines.
it's very specific, and it feels like earned. It's like the last, ugh, God, it's like there's something heartbreaking here
Yeah.
and really tender. And like, even though it's very simple, and like, yes, it's one of those poems where like, people like to say it's original because like only one person could have written it and blah, 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 blah. It's one of those poems where you start to feel
Yeah.
like, well, maybe someone else could have written this. But but like it's also one that just is honest and like it I am so endeared by the time I
Right.
get here that I'm perfectly fine with it. Yeah, he talks a lot about age, and I feel like you see that more and more toward the end of this book. The poem right before that, still not believing in age, I wake to find myself older than I can understand, with most of my life in a fragment that only I remember. Like, it's so plain spoken. That's obviously not the whole poem. It's very plain spoken, but it feels powerful enough. I feel lame talking about the power of a poem. But by
Well,
this,
but it's very real thing. I think people get confused and they'll say power, but I mean it is a very real. Again, it gets to this thing where like what I was saying earlier, where it's so hard to talk about a lot of this stuff that we just kind of latch on to phrases from other things, so power or consciousness or you know.
yeah.
So it can very easily be like something that, like you said, makes you feel cringe for using, but it's also like it is getting at something that's real, that's there. That's like we're trying to articulate that this made me feel something. Is that power, right? Are we using the right word? Who knows? Kind of. But yeah. Like I said, more people would be into poetry if we opened it up to that kind of shit, dude. Like that's what I think personally, but maybe not. Maybe it's just because nobody reads that.
Yeah, what was the poem that was like, right, he says, there's one other really funny moment, and I'm just trying to remember what it was. It was earlier. It's the one where he's like, I must be older now. You know, I imagine how like old I would choose to be, and it would be younger, so I guess I am older. Oh yeah, no, that's in the winter of my 38th year. We talked about it, didn't we?
Yeah, that was the best one. I thought that was my favorite,
Yeah.
and again, as I'm becoming approaching my mid 30s, I think maybe that's why it resonated with me too a little bit.
Yeah. Walking in fog and rain and seeing nothing. I imagine all the clocks have died in the night. Now no one is looking. I could choose my age. It would be younger. So I am older. It would be younger, so I suppose, so I am older. Yeah, there's also like this thing of a very natural state of hearing him thinking, and it doesn't feel obnoxious. Like I told you about the moment in poems that I get really bored with and really annoyed with is the one that's like, see this thing and I'm driving and I stop and I think, and then the thing that you're thinking is the rest of the poem. And so like I get so bored of that. I don't know what it is. I'm just like, because you're not actually thinking, you're like imagining a whole scene half the time. And I'm just like, why not just make that happen in the poem? Um, and maybe sometimes somewhere down the road it starts to feel formulaic of, I'm walking through the field and I stop and I wonder. I was watching the news and such was saying, and it made me think, like there's just all of
Right.
this. I see a lot of poems like that. I remember seeing a lot of poems like that in workshops and always being like kind of bored by it. And maybe that's some like frou-frou annoying, still young me saying
And
that.
I think it's also because that is an easier way. Like we can do. It's easier to do that than it is to struggle over every line, particularly if you're writing a lyric, right?
Well,
Where maybe it doesn't necessarily have to have anything concrete to say, right?
yeah.
So like if you're writing a lyric, I think sometimes it's easier to just like you said do this, like I stop somewhere and I squat down and take a shit and
I
like
I squat for my
Whitman,
dump and I think
and I'm squatting for you. My my
someone
dump is no different than your dump, and
I
our dumps together are America, and whatever it is, like
I stop somewhere squatting for you. Um
oh god.
yeah, no, but like I do think that he does this really graceful thing in these poems where you're watching the mind work something out. And that's also part of what I think makes it messy and makes it complicated. And while they seem really like simple and really in many ways plain spoken, they're like there are some really difficult poems, I think.
Well, I think that's you're right. Like that's the thing, right? Like there is a line. Like there's like some poems can get away with doing that if it hits the right spots and if it's all the different things that you're looking for. So like I mean, yeah, I mean anybody can be convinced. Like my your aesthetic can be changed any given time. This is why we always say buy these books, read these books, add them to your library, think about them, go back and reread them since you own it in your library, 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later. Did you think differently now? Like all that
Yeah, and
is.
this is a great one for the toilet. There are a lot of shorties in here, longer ones if, it's a longer toilet time. Um, I like to take my time personally. Not a, I'm not a quick dumper. Um, but yeah, I think this is definitely a collection worth having. It's one that I didn't know before I bought it that I was going to be really, really happy to have. It's like a poet that I resisted for
Right.
a long time. Didn't have any care for or interest in, was never really taught, with the exception of maybe one or two poems I read in an intro class.
Or yeah, he's in like contemporary anthologies. He's in like those all over the place.
Yeah,
So
all over the place, but like also what yeah, I find it kind of crazy that it was never for all of the classes I took where everyone was very concerned about teaching poets who are writing right now.
why we weren't teaching him.
why he was not one of the books, because I feel like I read nothing quite like this kind of sort of more bare, like stripped down style. Although I could
You
also
know,
understand why that would be less appealing to like an undergraduate, like,
you know what
poetry.
I'd be if I had total freedom to create courses, which I don't, because I'm an adjunct. So it's like if I had freedom to do that, I was actually a full time employee at these institutions. I would be interested to create like a Pulitzer class where you go over a few decades worth of Pulitzer winners. And, it would have to be like strictly poetry or strictly fiction to even fit all that shit in.
Yeah.
So if I would do like a poetry one, it'd be like 70s, like the Pulitzer winners of the 70s, and like especially the 70s, because I think like the 70s and the 60s, there were, almost all the ones that were winning those prizes, they were almost different every year. Like they were like, sure, there were some that were similar, but like they were almost different styles, and everything was changing so quickly, and so much influence happening all over the place that some of those periods I think could be interesting to just teach a whole course on like a 10 or 20-year period of all the
And there are all
Pulitzer
these different
winners.
schools, which, like, I don't know if that was so much. I mean, some of that I think was the thing that that poets were doing. They were like establishing like their schools and their manifestos. It was very much a manifesto time.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing a lot about manifestos now, but I assume that's just because I'm not reading them.
Well, and it's also because I mean, the manifestos are not as prevalent as they were even, 40 years ago.
Lots
So,
of
yeah,
defenses
lots of defenses,
and
but I would say,
denunciations.
and more so that like there are no distinct schools of writers right now. Like there is no distinct school. Like that stopped happening like in the 80s. Like there is just everybody is doing the same school now. And I mean, some people argue that, it's MFA or whatever it is. I mean, it's more complicated than that, I think, but and it
I do
coincides with
feel
a
like
couple of
there's this
different
one
trends.
school of like, we're still trying to be the New York writers.
The new school.
We're still trying to be the cool New York kids. And, I feel like they do like an Eileen Miles kind of thing.
Huh.
Like you
Well, my
occasionally
only
like find a clumping of poets who assert that there's some like New York poetry scene. And I'm like, yeah, as much as anywhere.
Well, I just mean for me right now, like I mean, when I read, not even I mean, I'm not a part of any scene, but it's just like, and I have no idea about the scenes all over the country, but
Is anyone
what I
a
mean
part
is,
of a scene unless like
well,
you work in publishing or you work like at a bookstore that has heavy literary connections because you like are with right next to a university with an MFA program, or you're just like really active and your writing community Facebook group, and
no.
you actually like go out to those bars and get those drinks with those people. Like,
Well, I just mean like the schools. Usually, we would talk about aesthetic, right? Like it's a
yeah.
certain aesthetic, a certain place that they're all coming from. Well, it's because everybody is practicing the same aesthetic right now. Like that's literally why there are no schools, and that school is just news headlines.
It's
So
not
it's
even the
literally
same aesthetic, it's the same. Merwin said something that I thought was really useful about political poems. They are mostly bad.
right. Yeah.
When they succeed, it's because I don't remember what exactly he said, but essentially what I understood him to be saying was that they expand out of the moment. Um,
Right.
but yeah, anything that is too hyper focused on a single event or a single moment, single political. He talked about this thing that happens where you run the risk of sort of flipping over into what he would call propaganda, right?
Yeah.
Or I might even say, you might even describe as like commercial, feeling like, that kind of messaging where it feels more like they're doing marketing as opposed to poetry.
Yeah, well, that's a good way to put it. And what I mean by that is just that, when I say everybody's just practicing the same school, it's because, yeah, I mean, most of what I read in any given journal is just, again, kind of a summary of what I could read in the New York Times, whatever, when I check it in the morning. Like, it's not, you're not saying anything that I haven't already seen 100 times by the time I read that poem.
Or just not doing it in a new way, not doing it in a way
Well,
that's like interesting, which
well,
is
that too. So
fine.
we're
Like most
failing.
people aren't going to.
Sure, and you could argue that, like, sure, like, whatever's happening culturally at any given moment is what's going to be reported on, and that's what people are going to be reading in, like, their papers and stuff. Like, all right, sure. But,
The
like,
thing I always come back to, that always bothers me, this is maybe a no-no to say, but fucking when Sharon Olds wrote her My White Privilege poem, I was like,
uh,
come the fuck. I mean, I don't even really like Sharon Olds very much. I was never like a huge fan, never really got into it. That might be
talk
interesting to
about bad line
explore
breaks.
later.
Yeah.
But
She's notorious for having terrible line integrity.
I just thought like, man, come on, like you're better than this. Like this poem, like is so one note, so uncomplicated, so it feels so much lacking in like genuine exploration or depth or any real sense of like a true honest human behind the page or anything that might speak, right? Because anything
Right.
could. um it felt like a commercial for a poem she thought she was supposed to write.
I mean, it felt like a summary of, again, like the New York Times op-ed
Yeah,
pages. Like,
it
that's
felt,
what it
I was just
was.
like,
It
oh
was
my
just,
God, like this
it was
gives me nothing.
a rehashing of everything you could read in the paper at any given week. Like, that's literally all I've been seeing the last, at least specifically the last 5 to 6 years. But that's a different thing.
Yeah, it's just boring. But yeah,
Well, that's
that's
what I
what
mean. It's boring because we've heard it
it's
before, kind of
boring and it's
thing. Like,
uninteresting and it doesn't move me at all. And like you could write that poem. Like you could write that poem and have it be good, but it has to come from a really genuine place and it has to be like thoughtful and it has to have depth. And that just fucking didn't. It just felt like you sat down, you like shat out this poem and maybe you changed a few words, but like you just put it out there because you're Sharon Olds and you can. And I'm like, I know none of this for fact, right? But, uh, that's what it felt like reading it. I was like, okay, is this really a
yeah.
poem that's going to be all over Instagram right now? Like,
That's interesting too. Instagram will make you hate something because it's just in your face all the time. So you just like seeing it, and then it'll make you like be like, why do I keep seeing this? When normally you would just read it once, in the journal and then put it down and you wouldn't encounter it again. But then if you're online, it'll like keep being put into your thing over and over again because all your friends or whatever are liking it.
yeah,
And you're just like, stop showing me this terrible poem. And it makes you
yeah.
get like an irrational kind of,
And then you get into this fucked up space where like half the poems you consume are consumed on Instagram and you're like, oh, this isn't how I want to decide how to read what I like want to read.
yeah.
It's just really fucked up. And I've bought books that way too. There was one book that I bought out of complete curiosity of a really, uh, not a super young poet, but a very contemporary poet. Um, Read the book, tried really hard to not be frustrated by it. Because it wasn't that the poems themselves were bad overall. They weren't all bad. It was that it was like, in many ways I thought it was ballsy, but in many more ways I thought it was like really obnoxious and unthoughtful and like spoke to exactly the personality that I don't want to meet in a poet. And I know maybe that's getting into a bad territory. I say bad like it means something here, but it gets into that fucked up territory of like, am I interested in a poet or am I interested in poems? And I think I am interested in poems, but when the poems offer a view of somebody who is, it just felt like a book that wanted to say fuck you to a bunch of writers, and it did, and in some ways was really ballsy, and in other places was like kind of interesting and like maybe even well done.
Right.
But in other places it was just obnoxious. It was like, how dare the world treat me this way? It felt like very much like the sort of activist book, but like it didn't feel like it genuinely cared about anyone but themselves. It was like
Right.
it was putting up this like front of I'm doing the good.
Well, that too, the lack of the universal is hurting the art right now too. But whatever, I'm bored with this. Let's wrap this up and
I
stop.
shouldn't fucking be saying any of this anyway.
Yeah, I was gonna say, let's stop saying things we have to cut out
Yeah.
before we release it to the public. Okay, if you want to contact us at heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. Subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/heavyboard. Our podcast is available wherever you want to get your podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, all of the above. Check it out. Subscribe for more. We post bi-weekly. Links to all the books and shit we covered in the description. And next episode we are doing, oh yeah, here we go, listeners. Yeah, we're doing Twilight, Stephanie Myers. That's her name, right?
Meyer, I don't fucking know.
Meyer.
I do know that I read them all.
Oh yeah. So
And
we're gonna do
I
this,
will
listeners.
be
Yeah.
excited to hear what team you are on. Can't wait. Really pumped.
Yeah, we're taking sides. Like, we're gonna take sides on this pod. I've never read any of the books, and I've never seen the movies either. I've seen parts of the first one, but I was not a Twilight guy.
I don't care about the movies. I was all for the books. All about it. Fucking enjoyed
Although-
the shit out of it as a nice little summer before college.
I do have a thing for Kristen
18.
Stewart, but yeah.
I don't. Her jaw really frustrates me.
Yeah.
Her jaw acting. She does a lot of jaw acting.
All right, then this is Heavy Board. I'll see. Guess we'll see you all next time.
Yeah, man, I'm feeling annoying as shit today. I think I could be real annoying.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy
Bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. Dinner,
Resources.
life, friends is boring. We must not say so. Are you radioactive now?
Inner.
Resources, American resources.
Being bored?
Some activities are intentional, right?
It shows such a lack
Heavy.
of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom,
Heavy.
I should say.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.